Thank you all for this chance to present some somewhat finished research from a somewhat finished doctoral dissertation. I'm doing a PhD in the University of Chicago, partly on Jewish history, partly on Irish history. But the paper I want to present tonight is about ideology. And specifically, it's about the ideologies of Zionism and Irish nationalism. And I want to talk about how both national movements, I think, are conceptually quite similar. Because both can be seen, first, as part of a general trend of European modernization in the second half of the 19th century, as part of a general history of European nationalism, and like many other European national movements, they exhibit a lot of very similar traits and characteristics. But also, Zionism and Irish nationalism were concerted efforts to disprove certain European stereotypes. Stereotypes which at their root were often allegations that the Irish and the Jews were incapable of national self-rule. In disproving these stereotypes, both Zionists and Irish nationalists sought to prove that they were in fact true Europeans and that they were worthy of being treated like other European nations. To borrow a very common Zionist slogan from the early years of the 20th century, both national movements sought to prove that they were indeed kichol hagoyim, like all the nations. Now, in general, the research I'm doing is on how both national movements sought to create idealized images of their own peoples as a method. And I want to suggest that one such method of creating an idealized image of the Jewish or Irish nations was language. But before I talk about any of that, I want to first talk about an act of gift-giving from 1914. In the spring of that year, fearing for the future of St. Enda's College, his perennially cash-strapped nationalist school, Patrick Pearse agreed to go on an extended trip to the United States, hoping there to gain funds from wealthy, nationalist-minded Irish Americans. The trip was partly organised through the Irish Republican Brotherhood, an organisation Pearse had just joined, and his involvement with which would lead 2 years later to his own death. In an open letter to the boys of St. Enda's sent from the United States, Pearse said he hoped his pupils had all been working hard since returning from their Easter holidays. He reassured them that he'd been telling American audiences what fine fellows you all are, and he let them know that upon his return he would regale them all with exciting tales of what he called the sea sharks and land sharks that he has encountered upon his voyages. In other words, Pearse made the kinds of statements that you would expect from a fairly liberal Edwardian educator, which is what he was in so many ways. But at the end of his letter, Pearse made a seemingly more unusual announcement to his students. Remember, he said, that rifle is still unwon. I want to give it away this summer, but it can only be given on condition that some boy wins it by a genuine effort to speak Irish. Now, it's partly because of this support for youthful violence, exhibited not only in this letter, but in his writings and his politics in general, that Pearse has not always received the warmest of appraisals from Irish historians. To give just the most famous example, Ruth Dudley Edwards, in her biography of Pearse, The Triumph of Failure, presented Pearse as a generally extreme figure. She called him militaristic, and she said that this letter to his students was one of his manifestos. But I want to suggest a quite different appraisal of Pearse and of Irish nationalism and of the contemporary Irish language movement in general. And it's an appraisal that takes the symbolism inherent in Pearse's letter as its starting point. This gift of a rifle to the best student of Irish at St. Enda's points to a deeper and I think much more complex issue in contemporary Irish nationalism. And this is the notion that Irish men had been emasculated by the slow process of Anglicisation. No longer speaking Irish, they were alienated from their true national spirit. They were deficient and deformed, and as such, they were no longer real men. The movement to revive the Irish language was thus imagined as a process of reasserting national power, and was often associated with a recovery of sovereignty and strength. Pearse's gift of a rifle had a clear layer of symbolic male power. Only when a boy had proven his mastery of his true native language would he be ready to wield this weapon. Both the gun and the language were symbols of a resurgent Irish national masculinity. Now, similar concerns to this had already appeared in Pearse's famous 1913 essay, The Murder Machine, a diatribe against the British educational system, which is the eponymous machine for Pearse. And this essay declares the British educational system to be worse than what Pearse called an edict for the general castration of Irish males. Where education should inspire and harden, Pearse said, British state schools instead work to tame and enervate. The result for Pearse is that Irishmen are, he says, not slaves merely, but very eunuchs. And he also argued in a possible hint at the physical act of castration that the current educational system in Ireland is akin to chopping off parts of children's bodies. A year later, in a speech which he delivered in Philadelphia during his tour of the US, Pearse again talked of how an anglicising education was, he says, emasculating our boys and corrupting our girls. He saw this as clear evidence of an English government conspiracy to enslave Ireland and cut off future generations from a proud history. Thus, Irish schoolboys, he claimed, were not taught to be brave, to be strong, to be truthful, to be self-reliant, and to be proud. Now, by no means was Pearse the only Irish language activist to draw out these connections between language and power. A desire for a revival and a perpetual fear that the language would soon disappear and that something very important would be lost with it have long been features of Irish language discourse. In the first half of the 19th century, for instance, Thomas Davis had some very similar ideas to Pearse. He said that to impose another language on such a people is to send their history adrift amidst the accidents of translation. 'Tis to cut off the entail of feeling and separate the people from their forefathers by a deep gulf. 'Tis to corrupt their very organs. The language of a nation's youth, Davis concluded, is the only easy and full speech for its manhood and for its age. And certainly the ideas of national decay and via the Irish language some kind of national revival were already implicit in the ideology of the Gaelic Union, a precursor to the Gaelic League, which was active in the 1870s and 1880s. The Gaelic Union's membership card, for instance, depicted Ireland as a dark and decrepit land, whilst also suggesting the possibility of linguistic rejuvenation via the familiar symbol of a distant rising sun. And presumably these were the ideas which a Gaelic Union member was to hold close to their body along with their membership card. The inaugural issue of the Gaelic Union's Irislaur na Gaeilge, or the Gaelic Journal, featured a poem with a very pleading title of May the Gaels Live, and insisting that now the Gaels are alive in Ireland and the Gaels and the Irish language are in Ireland yet, the journal clearly pointed to an anxiety about racial and linguistic decline in this poem. The poem's declaration that it is not true that the land or the language are in decline, it is not true that our spirit is quietly spent, signposts an obvious if reluctant admission that something is not as it should be in Ireland and that that something is related to language. But the masculine components of these anxieties only became fully apparent after the founding of the Gaelic League in 1893. As an 1899 editorial in the League's On Clive Sullish, or the Sword of Light, phrased it, for instance, the language was a link to a mythical past. Without this link, the Irish would be a deficient people, lacking an important element of their heritage. On Clive Sullish went on to say that the customs, beliefs, and dreams of their forefathers were embalmed in the language. It preserved undying the image of Ireland, clothed in the ancient Druid romances. Hence the extinction of such a language would be to them an irretrievable loss, a gap in the continuity of their national being, the cutting off of their intellectual life, the cutting off of their religious life, their sacred traditions and romances, and their martyr struggles. And all this talk of cutting off, of course, echoes some of the anxieties Pearse would later point to. Now, a year after this, in 1900, the Reverend Michael O'Hickey, a prominent clerical supporter of the Gaelic League and a professor of Irish at Maynooth College, condemned the low level of resistance to the absence of the Irish language in the primary educational system. And he asked, are the Irish people going to endure this? If so, they deserve the worst that has ever been said of them. They are a people without spirit, without national self-respect, without racial pride, a poor, fibreless, degenerate, emasculated, effete race, eminently deserving of the contempt of mankind. A student of O'Hickey's at Maynooth, Patrick Ford, was probably showing some of his teacher's influence when he claimed that speaking only English, we can never be perfect men, full and strong men, able to do a true man's part for God and fatherland. Ford went on to describe in some very exaggerated language how the Irish language could be a means of communing with a kind of historical Irish masculinity. I don't ask you to go hunting after tidbits of curious information, he said, to become dry antiquarians, to peep and botanize upon the grave of Mother Erin. Look to your forefathers, Ford said. Read of them. Speak of them, not in unworthy mendicant eloquence, nor yet in vulgar boasting about our ancient glories while we squat down in disgraceful content with our present degeneracy, nor least of all in miserable petty controversy with the hireling liars who calumniate our dear Ireland. No, said Ford, but to learn from them what you ought to be, what God destined Irish men to be. And if an Irish man could only be perfect when he spoke the language of his forefathers, without this language he would be, as another Gaelic League pamphlet phrased it, a self-degraded and denationalised being who is proud of being mean and who glories in being abject. Unsurprisingly, though, once such an abject young Irishman learnt Irish, a language of which he supposedly was previously ashamed, he would gain pride and self-respect from the knowledge, as the Gaelic League said, that his Celtic ancestors were worthy of the vigorous and refined language they spoke, and that Ireland has produced sages who in wisdom and learning were not surpassed by men of any nation in the world, and warriors who in valour might vie with the proudest of other lands. The return to Irish for the Gaelic League was thus imagined as a return to a more glorious and heroic sense of Irish identity before the humiliation of being deprived of state power by colonial rule. Now this prompts the first question I want to answer in this paper. Why did so many Irish nationalists feel there was a link between language and power? Well, first, as I've been hinting, these desires to project a stronger and more respectable image of Irish manhood were part of an anti-colonialist project to refute the popular late 19th century idea that the Irish were incapable of self-rule. A common contemporary perception in the late 19th century, as one Irish language scholar has recently observed, was the belief that an te lawer berla awan bofwi smach sasna a via waver. He who speaks only English is under English mental control. Learning Irish was thus partly about throwing off the indignity of colonial rule, whilst also disproving the negative stereotypes of British rule. But the second reason, I think, has to do with changes in Ireland's social, economic and political structures in the decades after the famine, when Ireland was being integrated more and more into a British-centric economic system. And this also fed into a greater awareness of Ireland as a space distinct from Britain and created a greater perceived need for Irish unity. The construction of rail transport and the shortening of travel times in the decades after the famine all fed into a growing sense of an imagined Irish community, all living in a shared space, a shared modern Irish space. The focus on recovering a mythic past was a means of negotiating this very rapid transformation towards modernity, of negotiating the very unsettling sense that in capitalism all that is solid melts into air. These changes also created a new awareness of the Gaeltacht as a distinct space. The Irish-speaking western seaboard had long been removed from the rest of the country, but now was in the process of being discovered by the Gaelic League. The Gaeltacht was being created as an accessible space through the railways, even as the economic development that facilitated that accessibility would destroy it as an Irish-speaking area. Moreover, the Gaeltacht's residents were valorised as the newly discovered but ancient repositories of Irish-speaking culture, something that did not always sit easily with the continuing idea that they were a backward people in need of reform. And within this new Ireland, the Gaelic League had some very specific suggestions for how Irish people could connect to a lost sense of identity. One very popular one was to change your name from your supposedly false English name to your true Irish name. Part of also throwing off your false English identity and embracing your newly found true Irish identity. This was the process whereby, for instance, Pierce Beasley, the son of Irish immigrants in Liverpool, became Peirish Bosley, a Gaelic Leaguer, a volunteer, a pro-treaty Sinn Féiner, and Michael Collins' first biographer. John Leslie, a very prominent member of the Gaelic League, as well as a landed nobleman, an Oxford graduate and the first cousin of Winston Churchill, became Sean Leslie. And of course, Patrick Pearse, the son of a Birmingham stonecutter, became Pádraig Mac Piarish, as well as adopting pen names that suggested some kind of recovered Gaelic ideal, pen names such as Colm O'Connora and Cuivin O'Cualan. Now again, Pearse was picking up on ideas popular throughout the contemporary Irish language movement. In 1899, when presenting evidence to a government inquiry into education, the president of the Gaelic League, Douglas Hyde, or on Craven Avon, the pleasant little tree branch as he sometimes liked to be known, argued that the nation had become ashamed of their Irish names. And Hyde let it be known that he, and indeed the Gaelic League in general, believe that no good can result to national character from such a state of things as that. Moreover, he said, no wise government, unless it was deliberately playing the game to weaken the people, would have allowed such a tone of mind as that to have arisen. 4 years later, in 1903, in an attempt to have the post office accept letters addressed in Irish, Hyde sent a volume to the post office that he says gives the correct forms of Irish names which are now being widely adopted, as well as what he dismissed as the vulgarized and corrupt forms which are also in vogue. The same year, Nellie Negev, or Nellie O'Brien, a leading figure in the Gaelic League's Dublin-based Craven na Cuaig, or the branch of the 5 provinces, spoke with pride of what she called the good old Irish names of her 3 sons, Donna, Pádraig and Fionn. Now, like Hyde, Negev or O'Brien was a Protestant, as were a disproportionate number of Craven na Cuaig, and it would not be a stretch to imagine that such a supposedly Irish practice served to reaffirm their sense of national identity. Indeed, Douglas Hyde liked to regularly tell the story that the Reverend R.R. Kane, a staunchly anti-Home Rule Protestant cleric from Belfast, had once confessed to Hyde that he could never forget his real name was O'Kane. But it was not only Protestants or those with an English ancestry who were, first of all, at risk of being placed outside the boundaries of the nation, who engaged in this practice. Patrick Inglesby, one of the main organisers of the Gaelic League's very popular Irish language parades, which were held every year in Dublin in the early years of the 20th century, decided that he would rather be known as Pádraig Mac Gille Isha, literally Patrick, son of the servant of Jesus. And nor was it only men who would change their names. Agnes Farrelly, a feminist, an educator, and one of the leading female figures in the early Gaelic League, decided after her first visit to the Aran Islands that she would no longer like to be known by her birth name of Agnes Mary Winifred Farrelly, and would instead like to be known as Una Ní Farrelly. Now this leads me to the second question I want to address with this paper. What does any of that have to do with Jewish history, the history of Zionism or of the State of Israel, or even just the history of the revival of Hebrew? I want to suggest that we can start to see the answer to this question by looking at this practice of Irish nationalists changing their name, and in a contemporary Zionist practice of doing something very, very similar. And we can see this if we take as an example a young man named David Green from a small town called Płock in rural Poland. He had a very typical Jewish upbringing. He spoke Yiddish growing up, until in 1904 he moved to what was then Ottoman Palestine and decided that from now on he would like to be known as David Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion would later claim, after he became the first Prime Minister of Israel, when addressing a room full of recently arrived Jewish immigrants from Morocco, that they must forget they are Moroccan, just as Ben-Gurion said, "I have forgotten that I am Polish." Ben-Gurion's successor as Prime Minister of the State of Israel was Moshe Sharet, who was born Moshe Chertok. Moshe Chertok later on was succeeded by Levi Eshkol, who was born Levi Shkolnik, and Levi Eshkol was succeeded by a woman who was born Goldie Meyerson, or who would later become Golda Meir. And adopting new Hebrew names and expecting others to do the same was a central part of how all these people forged a new Israeli identity. And much like in Irish nationalism, this was also part of building a new, proud, strong identity. The early Zionists, as the historian Amos Ilan has noted, had a proclivity to redefine themselves with names that denote firmness, toughness, strength, courage, and vigour. Names that became very popular later on in Israel, such as Yariv, or antagonist, Oz, meaning strength, Tamir, towering, Baradan, son of the master or masterful, and even one name Bar Shilton, he who is fit to govern. Much like in the revival of Irish, Zionists, by reviving Hebrew, sought to create a new, proud biblical identity and to prove both to themselves and others, most importantly, that they were indeed Bar Shilton, that they were fit to govern. There are two very good examples of this that I want to look at. First of all, an Israeli poet called Ava Yeshurun, who was a quite popular poet in the 60s and 70s. He was born Yechiel, which, as well as advertising a Yiddish background, is also a very feminine name. It means the Yiddish mother of pearl. He decided later in life that he would like to be known as Afat Yeshurun, which literally means the fathers are watching us, or it can mean fathers of the people of Israel. And thus his name was part of his new Zionist strong identity as a man rooted in the soil of the land of Israel. Another very illustrative case, I think, is that of the so-called first Hebrew child, Ben-Zion ben Yehuda. Ben-Zion ben Yehuda was the son of a man who was born Eliezer Yitzhak Perlman, who upon leaving what was then Ukraine and moving to Ottoman Palestine, decided he would rather be known as Eliezer ben Yehuda. And if you've ever been to Israel, you've probably been on a Ben Yehuda street. And the elder Ben Yehuda was a key figure in the revival of modern Hebrew. His name, Ben Yehuda, means son of Judea, and quite obviously shows how he feels now rooted in the soil of his biblical homeland. His son, who grew up barred from speaking any language but Hebrew, was given this name Ben-Zion ben Yehuda, that means son of Zion, son of Judea, also reflecting an identity rooted in the soil of the biblical homeland. Just to complicate all this, as an adult, Ben-Zion ben Yehuda decided he would rather be known as Itamar ben Avi. Itamar means a date tree and is a very commonly used Zionist symbol on flags and posters and so on. His surname Ben Avi literally means son of my father. But because the letter B and the letter V are the same in Hebrew, it also means son of A-B-Y, son of the initials of Eliezer ben Yehuda. So quite clearly, both father and son were involved in a process of self-invention, creating new Hebrew-speaking identities and new names for new men rooted in the soil of their Hebrew-speaking homeland. And that Hebrew revivalists would engage in a very similar practice to their Irish contemporaries, I think, is unsurprising, because both drew on a similar set of ideas about history and national revival, and about the idea that a deformed language could be the sign of a deeper national deformity. Even the titles of two of the most important Hebrew and Irish revivalist journals are remarkably similar. First of all, HaShachar, the Dawn, edited in Russia in the 1870s and 1880s by Peretz Smolenskin, and secondly, Fáinne an Lae, the Dawning of the Day, operated by the Gaelic League in the early years of the 20th century. Both titles heavily suggest a return to some kind of lost national ideal after a long night, or maybe even a long nightmare, of exile or foreign control. The idea that a national rebirth was necessary also appears in the works of two of the most important Zionist and Irish nationalist writers, Leo Pinsker and Terence McSweeney. Leo Pinsker was a Russian Jewish physician, and following a wave of anti-Jewish violence in Russia in 1882, in the aftermath of Tsar Alexander II's assassination, Pinsker began to draw some very broad links between Jewish identity, a lack of state power, and the continuous resurgence across European history of antisemitism. He did all this in an essay called Auto-Emancipation, a short but very influential essay that would have a very strong influence on an organization called Chovei Zion, or the Lovers of Zion, who were the first Zionist organization, and they themselves formed the first Zionist community in Palestine, Rishon LeZion, the first to Zion. And central to Pinsker's analysis is the idea that the lack of state power has had a deep psychological effect on Jews, and this, he believed, was the cause of anti-Semitism's perennial recurrence across European history. Because for Pinsker, a healthy nation could only be one that has a state. And I want to quote a couple of chunks of Pinsker's essay. He talks about the Jewish people as having the ghost-like apparition of a living corpse, of a people without unity or organization, without land or other bonds of unity, no longer alive and yet walking among the living. And much as Pinsker had a very simple explanation for the cause of anti-Semitism, so he also had a very simple solution. If it is statelessness that has caused anti-Semitism, therefore the Jews must have their own state. The only solution, Pinsker said, is in the creation of a Jewish nationality, a people living upon its own soil, the auto-emancipation of the Jews, their return to the ranks of the nations by the acquisition of a Jewish homeland. But Pinsker's ideas, I think, bear more than a passing resemblance to the arguments advanced in Terence McSweeney's 1912 collection of essays, The Principles of Freedom. Now, McSweeney was a playwright, a leading member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, a member of Sinn Féin, and then in 1920 the mayor of Cork until he was arrested for sedition and went on hunger strike for 74 days until he died. But writing in 1912, McSweeney also believed that a lack of political sovereignty had led to what he called corruption and national subjection, and even the language he used is strikingly similar to that of Pinsker. The moral plague, McSweeney says, that eats up a people whose independence is lost is more calamitous than any physical rending of limb from body. The body is a passing phase, the spirit is immortal, and the degradation of that immortal part of man is the great tragedy of life. And McSweeney asked, consider all the mean things that wither up a people in a state of slavery. The soul of that people is revolting and terrible for how things degraded and the great destinies imperiled. So again, just as a lack of national sovereignty had caused this internal Irish degradation, so a return to sovereignty would of course make the Irish whole again, a nation with a state just like any other normal European nation. And even the titles, I think, of auto-emancipation and Sinn Féin point to a very similar politics of social reform. Both carry suggestions that in the process of national liberation, we ourselves will also be liberated, reformed and taught to be self-reliant, suggesting, of course, that we ourselves are very much in need of such reform. And that a revival of the Hebrew language would cure Jews of some kind of national decay was also a central idea in Jonathan Ratush's 1943 essay, Kitav Halanoar HaIvri, the Epistle to the Hebrew Youth. Now, Ratush was a poet and a leading figure in what's usually called the Canaanite movement, a somewhat eccentric group of people who believed not that an Israeli identity should be created, but an Israelite identity, to completely replace the Jewish diaspora. In doing this, they took to its logical, if eccentric, conclusion the Zionist idea of Shelilat HaGolah, the negation of the diaspora. And Ratush talked in this essay of how a chasm of different opinions and alienation separated the proud Hebrew-speaking pioneers of Israel from what he saw as a degenerated diaspora. Those who spoke Hebrew, Ratush believed, had freed themselves from what he, with some very exaggerated language, called tafsechim nefshot, mental or psychological neuroses of the Jewish diaspora, a diaspora that implicitly for Ratush was Yiddish-speaking. But this new sense of Hebrew-speaking pride, Ratush believed, stemmed from the what he would have seen as Israelites' new life, rooted in what he very provocatively called Hamoledet HaIvrit, the Hebrew homeland. Tom. Now, in all of this, I'm very influenced by a historian called David Myers, and a quite provocative book that he wrote called Reinventing the Jewish Past, European Jewish Intellectuals and the Zionist Return to History. And in this book, Myers argues that the idea that a return to Palestine or Israel would free the Jewish people from a life lived outside of history was a recurrent feature in early 20th century Zionist thought. Now, for Myers, this stems from what he sees as a complex paradox inherent to Zionism. Zionism is, Myers says, at one and the same time very, very similar to other European nationalisms, and yet it's also very similar to anti-colonial and third world nationalisms in the way in which it seeks to disprove certain European racist stereotypes. And Myers says this is something unique about Zionism, but I want to disagree. As I've been arguing in this paper, this in fact was something Zionism clearly shared with Irish nationalism. And indeed, the idea that a return to Irish would be a return to history, and then thus a return to a lost European identity, was a common idea in the ideology of the Gaelic League. And it would emerge in quite similar ways as it would also emerge in Zionist utopian fantasies about a new Hebrew-speaking life in the land of Israel. Can't bring them anywhere. I want to end, though, by looking not at another similarity between Hebrew and Irish, but by looking at one of the most obvious differences, the success of Hebrew's revival versus the seeming failure of the Irish revival. Now, the idea that a link exists between a lost language and some sort of national deficiency has had a long half-life in Ireland. At the 1932 Sinn Féin Ardèche, for instance, the then head of the party, Brian O'Higgins, or Brian O'Higgin, delivered a tirade about the English government, who displayed what he called Kiel and Dowel Féin, the rationality of the devil himself, in their diabolical schemes to destroy Irish national identity. Such schemes, he claimed, had led to the situation whereby ni I corpawan atá era ceangalta le galamh ach di neagna agus I món cioma. It is not only in the body that Ireland is connected to the foreigner, in other words, the English, but also in consciousness and in mind. O'Higgins continued his speech, albeit in some apologetic English. And now I must speak to you in this other tongue that is a living and constant reproach to us, a constant reminder that we are an enslaved nation, that we are bound body and mind to our one and only enemy in the world, and that to be free we must come back to the truth, build up from the foundations again, and make ourselves fit for freedom when it comes. Now, while Sinn Féin were by this point little more than a fringe element in Irish politics, their leader was expressing a commonly held notion about the links between masculinity, male power, national power, and the Irish language. But perhaps it's this focus on the language as a symbol of recovered national power that explains one of the most obvious paradoxes in the history of Irish nationalism. Irish nationalists clearly displayed a strong anxiety about the decline of Irish, and yet since 1922, the Irish state has seemed singularly incapable of reviving this language. And given how interventionist that state could be in many other areas, such as citizens' private lives, their choice of reading material, their choice of leisure habits, this failure is perplexing and I think requires explanation. This is especially requiring explanation, I think, when we recall that the revival of Hebrew often went hand in hand with some coercive suppressions of Yiddish, both in Palestine and later in the State of Israel. To give just a few examples of this, in as early as 1914, when Chaim Zhitlowski, a very prominent Yiddish language activist from Europe, came on a visit to what was then Ottoman Palestine, he was physically assaulted by students from Gimnazia Herzliya, the most prominent Zionist school in the country, and they were probably prompted to do that by their then headmaster, Chaim Bubrashov. And similarly, in 1927, when plans were announced to establish a chair of Yiddish studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, it was seen as an act of sabotage against the Hebrew character of this emerging Jewish state. One Hebrew language organization, the very subtly titled Brigade for the Defense of the Hebrew Language, piled stones in the university's courtyard, ready to smash windows if the chair in Yiddish studies was ever established. The same organization placed posters around the university declaring that the chair in jargon is the destruction of the Hebrew University, and the chair in jargon is an idol in the Hebrew temple. Now, first of all, describing Yiddish as jargon serves to just dismiss it as a kind of degenerated form of German. But the provocative language serves also to demonize Yiddish as some kind of alien or threatening identity, and the design of the posters features the black border typical to Jewish death notices. But despite that coercion, Zionists also showed a real pragmatism about language, recognizing the need to not control all aspects of modern Hebrew. Addressing the 5th National Conference of the Brigade of the Defenders of the Hebrew Language in Tel Aviv in 1929, Joseph Klausner, who himself was a professor at the Hebrew University and was probably involved in some of the disturbances on campus, warned his audience to stop obsessing over grammatical mistakes in modern vernacular Hebrew. Such errors, he declared, are not mistakes at all when you write modern Hebrew. Stop scaring us constantly that we are writing with mistakes because in phrase X, in Mishnah Y, and in Midrash Z, the phrase is different. And while he unsurprisingly took issue with the use of Yiddish, he also felt that a limited number of barbarisms, which is to say words borrowed from other languages, is natural. No language, Klausner said, was ever developed without a conscious or subconscious influence of another language. Evoking some of his deeper concerns, Klausner concluded that he sought not the language of a fishwife in the marketplace, rather that we will speak and write as free men in their own language and not as slaves to Isaiah and Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. Indeed, unlike Irish, modern Hebrew also developed a very broad-ranging slang. One type of Hebrew slang was Dugri, and like many words in Hebrew slang, it comes from Arabic. In Arabic, Dugri means straight or direct. In Hebrew, it means telling the truth straight to someone's face, without equivocation, the opposite of any kind of hypocritical behind-the-back talk. And Dugri also contained an element of pride and irreverence. A person who spoke Dugri was saying that he or she was a native Israeli who said what they thought without fear. Dugri was a sign of honesty and the courage to speak boldly, without embellishment, without prevarication, and on a high moral level. Now again, not only does this point to how language and national pride are linked, but it also shows the real pragmatism of Hebrew revivalists, as they borrowed from other languages, including Arabic, which we would not expect at all, to fashion their own modern national language. But perhaps such a focus on the Irish language as a living thing, as something capable of change and of borrowing from other languages, would have defied the purpose of its so-called revival in the first place. Perhaps the purpose with Irish was always to engage in the act of symbolic defiance which relearning Irish facilitated, rather than just recreating the language as a run-of-the-mill vernacular. Bilingualism and the ongoing act of learning Irish serve as clear symbols of the harm done by colonial rule and of the need for government action to rectify this. Irish remained a language to be appreciated for its symbolic content, as a means of reconnecting to a nostalgic and harmonious pre-Anglicization Irish past. Unlike Hebrew in Palestine and later in the State of Israel, governments in Ireland probably never intended for Irish to be an actual vernacular language of the entire population. And indeed, I want to conclude that had Irish actually become a vernacular language like Hebrew, something very important for Irish nationalists would have been lost: a politically useful set of ideas about national symbolic power. Thank you.